Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca. I'm happy to be here today. I'm going to be talking to you about the economics of forest restoration on federal forest lands in Arizona. I'm going to try to have a little fun, so bear with me. I'm here today with my gummy colas, because you can't live without those, and my iced coffee, because it's 110 degrees outside. And, you know, we really are in the prime of our wildfire season here in Arizona, so it's a perfect time to talk about forest conditions and the issues associated with wildfire and some of the economics surrounding that. So the reason it's so vitally important that we deal with these issues is that those headwaters, those forested communities, provide a majority of the surface water supply here in the greater Phoenix metropolitan area. So the health of those forests is really vital to the water supplies down here in the valley. So with that, I'm going to start walking us through what the issues are and then talk a little bit about some of the economic issues that I uncovered through my analysis and research. So here we go. So the Government Accountability Office in Washington reported that catastrophic wildfires threaten resources and communities throughout the West. Much of the problem, it concluded, was the fact that the Forest Service's decision-making process is broken. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and specifically in regards to the NEPA process, which over a very long period of time has held up decision-making on Forest Service lands, some for the good and maybe some not for the benefit of the resources. So here in Arizona, ponderosa pine forest habitats used to look like this. They were relatively open and were dominated by large mature pine trees with rich grasses and shrubs underneath. So what we've been seeing today, though, is a changed community structure. Now these ponderosa pine forests, this is the same forest type, are overcrowded, making them susceptible to beetle infestation, drought, fire, and other human impacts. And as you probably remember from your natural resource law class, 100 years of this guy, essentially 100 years of fire suppression, is what has led to those conditions. Now, the Forest Service thought that they were doing the right thing, protecting those timber resources, right? You don't want the wildfires that move through there. But essentially what it's created is those dense forest structures that are really overgrown and susceptible to fire. So I'm going to go through a quick series of images that show you the increase in intensity and scale of wildfire in our watersheds over the last couple of decades. So this shows you the two largest wildfires on record for the 1980s in the Salt and Verde watersheds. And this is the Phoenix greater metropolitan area here. And those two watersheds feed the surface water supply for the Phoenix area. So the Bootleg Fire and the Jacket Fire were the two largest fires on record, and in that decade, about 80,000 acres burned. In the 1990s, the two largest wildfires on record were the Dude Fire and the Lone Fir Fire, and in that decade, over 200,000 acres burned in and around the watershed. And now what we've seen post-2000s is a drastic increase in both the size and scale of wildfires. You probably have heard about both the Rodeo Chediskai Fire as well as the Wallow Fire. And in that decade, in the past of 2000s, we've seen over 2 million acres burned in and around our watershed. So fires that used to burn like this, ground fires, and would revitalize forest structure and community, now burn like this up into the crowns and destroy entire landscapes. And when you add rain to the mix, you get conditions like this. So without vegetation to absorb the rain, that stormwater runs down burned slopes and causes flooding impacts throughout the watershed, including into the downstream communities of the Phoenix metropolitan area. And so there's a large group of people that are trying to think about what we should do to deal with these forest conditions, the 100 years of dense forest structure that we're now seeing. And so the Forest Service, along with a broad group of stakeholders, has gotten together to talk about how to reduce the high-intensity wildfires. So they've created a program called the 4 Forest Restoration Initiative, which is essentially a collaborative effort to accelerate landscape-scale restoration of portions of 4 national forests north of the Mogollon Rim. So FORFRI invites industry partners to develop saleable products from small-diameter logs, biomass, and other harvested materials as a byproduct of restoration. And these efforts therefore make it possible for businesses to underwrite some of the costs of forest restoration. So in my research, some of what I looked at was full cost accounting for wildfire. And here's a report that describes the full cost accounting for the Schultz fire, which was a 15,000 acre fire outside of the Flagstaff area. And essentially what it showed was that while the fire suppression costs alone were in the range of about $60 million, when you look at all of the subsequent impacts after, the impacts to business and homes and communities and people, and insurance costs, the full accounting of those costs exceed over $150 million. So it becomes much, much more costly to deal with these fires after the fact. And there's been an effort in the Mokelumne watershed in California, in the Sierra Nevadas, to evaluate these same kinds of impacts. And their watershed is very similar to ours. You get your water from the northern parts of the watershed and the forested landscapes. That water feeds local communities and downstream municipalities. It goes into a series of reservoirs, goes to farmlands, and then again municipal purposes. So it's a very similar area, and so we can derive a lot of benefit from looking at what they've done there. And so essentially they found that to go in and restore forests prior to a forest fire costs about $1,000 to $2,000 an acre. And the benefits of that, the costs are about $68 million for their watershed. And what they found was the benefits range between $126 million to $224 million. So the benefits far outweigh the costs. And the benefits include things like structure saved, avoided fire cleanup costs, carbon sequestered, which I'll talk about shortly, the timber from the treatment, avoided suppression, biomass, road issues, transmission lines, which we have as well here, and avoided sediments for utilities such as the utilities that serve the water supplies for the valley. And so I think we can derive a lot of benefit from looking at those kinds of studies, the avoided cost studies, and looking to see how they may apply here in northern Arizona. And so what they found was that field treatments can significantly reduce the size and severity of wildfires. The economic benefits of their modeled fuel treatments are 2 to 3 times the costs, and that there are many beneficiaries from increased fuel treatments, especially taxpayers. So another study that I looked at was a valuation study. It was a willingness to pay study of downstream irrigators in the Verde Valley, and they evaluated the willingness to pay for these forest restoration treatments. And what they found was that there was a statistically significant and positive willingness to pay within those irrigators of $183 per household at an aggregated benefit of more than $400,000 annually for approximately 2,000 irrigators. And their benefit estimates provide evidence that downstream irrigators may be willing to invest in landscape-scale forest restoration to maintain those watershed services. And so, again, we can derive some additional information about the potential willingness to pay not just for irrigators, but perhaps for other downstream users as well, such as municipalities and tribes and other users of the water supply. So we also know that those forests derive public and private goods. The private goods obviously are the timber and the fuel wood, and the public goods are those that really are not accounted for, those watershed services that that willingness to pay study evaluated, including just the water supply and the water quality, as well as air quality, carbon sequestered, and recreational benefits. And so those are important qualities and goods to measure in some way when looking at the benefits of restoration in the long run. And so in my research, one of the things that I really found was that there's not a lot of debate about going in there and getting the restoration treatments done. The environmental groups are on board, the industry people are on board. There is a little bit of dialogue about how much to take out and where to take it out, because we do have issues associated with Mexican spotted owl, which is a species listed under Endangered Species Act, as well as northern goshawk, which is a Forest Service sensitive species, and there's very specific guidelines associated with how to manage forests for those species. So the environmental groups are very concerned about such things as large tree retention and canopy openness, and currently the Forest Service is working through the NEPA documentation, and we're very, very close to a NEPA decision. And what we're hoping through this collaborative effort, these stakeholders, including the broad range of groups, including the Center for Biological Diversity and the Grand Canyon Trust, is that we can engage all of those groups, get them on board, and avoid litigation at the end. But we all know that that may not happen. It may be good for the Center for Biological Diversity, but there may be some other sort of left-wing environmental organization that doesn't really appreciate any timber extraction. So they there's a potential to hold that up through the NEPA process, and that's one of the big issues, is simply the holdup, not whether it happens or not, but just the holdup by itself. The other issue is really the federal budgeting process. And so right now they're talking about bringing industry in to take care of some of these issues, but that still requires some amount of investment on the federal government's part. And what the industry is telling us is that without long-term contracts over 10 years, say 20 years, there's really a big issue associated with the risk of investing in the infrastructure needed to reinvigorate the industry in Arizona. Because like in most states, the industry has really failed during the 1990s because of the timber wars, because of endangered species. And historically, timber management was clear cutting, and it was not good for the environment at all. There was a lot of issues associated with how the contracting worked, the externalities, if you will, the sedimentation, and the issues associated with endangered species management. And so now what they're looking at is restoring these forests, and as a byproduct, allowing industry to come in and leverage those products to create a profit. But the timber industry is essentially saying we need a lot more certainty about how those forest supplies will be allocated over a longer period of time. And the federal government is having a very difficult time ensuring long-term supplies of timber, as well as more than one annual budgeting cycle at a time. And so those were the two main areas. It was the NEPA and it was the federal budget that really seemed to be the holdup. And of course, those two things are not very easy to fix if you think about the legislative initiatives that would be required to, say, streamline NEPA, or to fix the budgeting process, which has always been an annual budgeting process. So thinking about ways to create systems for multi-year budgeting processes, which would give the industry much more certainty about going in there, developing products based on biomass, based on small diameter fuel wood, based on those kinds of products that really maintain the important habitat parameters, but then also improve forest conditions and create resiliency to those landscape level impacts, such as climate change, such as fire, such as insect infestation. And so that was really the majority of the research that I did. I think there's a lot of potential, especially through this forest restoration initiative. There's a lot of momentum, but we still contend with the annual budgeting cycle and the NEPA process. So we're expecting the record of decision from the first phase of the forest restoration initiative this July, we're hoping, and then we will see what happens thereafter. Maybe some appeals or objections, but maybe not, and we're hoping to get work done on the ground soon, and we're hoping to end up with upside down, our rainbow over the forested community, and which will lead us back to these kinds of beautiful open landscape conditions that are much more resilient to drought, fire, and human impacts. So with that, I will say goodbye and thank you. It's been fun having this class. I've learned a great deal.